When Park Ranger Sarah Williams was conducting her morning patrol along the Yellowstone River, she never expected to witness a tiny Mustang foal being swept away by the rushing spring waters while his desperate mother watched helplessly from the bank. The 3-week-old colt had no chance of survival in the ice-cold rapids that had already claimed the lives of several adult animals that season. But what happened next would challenge everything wildlife experts believed about human intervention in nature and lead to one of the most controversial yet inspiring rescue stories in National Park Service history. The person who made the split-second decision to dive into those deadly waters wasn't who anyone would expect, and their heroic action would spark a debate about wildlife conservation that reached the highest levels of government while creating an unbreakable bond that would change both their lives forever. Sarah Williams had been a ranger at Yellowstone National Park for 8 years, but she'd never experienced a spring quite like 2023. Record snowfall in the Rocky Mountains had created dangerously high water levels throughout the park, turning normally peaceful streams into raging torrents that posed serious threats to both wildlife and visitors. Sarah, a 34-year-old wildlife biologist turned park ranger, was conducting her daily patrol along the Yellowstone River corridor when she spotted the small band of wild mustangs grazing near the water's edge. The horses weren't technically supposed to be in this section of the park, but the unusual flooding had displaced many animals from their normal territories. The lead mare, a beautiful bay Mustang with distinctive white markings, was grazing with her tiny foal staying close by her side. The baby, probably only 3 weeks old, showed the classic signs of Spanish colonial horse bloodlines: a dark brown coat with primitive markings and the sturdy build that had helped Mustangs survive in the American West for centuries. Sarah stopped her ATV about 200 yards away and pulled out her binoculars to observe the family group without disturbing them. Park protocol required minimal human interference with wildlife, but Sarah's training included monitoring animal behavior for signs of distress or danger. What she observed through her binoculars made her heart race with concern. The foal was showing signs of weakness and disorientation that suggested he might be suffering from a condition common in young horses during stressful situations, a drop in blood sugar that could cause confusion and loss of coordination. The mother mare seemed to sense her baby's distress and was nudging him away from the water's edge, but the foal's responses were sluggish and uncoordinated. Instead of following his mother to safety, he was stumbling closer to the riverbank where the spring runoff had created an undercut ledge that dropped directly into the fast-moving current. Sarah reached for her radio to call for backup from the wildlife management team, but before she could make contact, the situation became critical. The foal, disoriented and weak, stumbled too close to the unstable riverbank. The soft earth gave way beneath his small hooves, and he tumbled directly into the raging Yellowstone River. The current immediately swept the tiny foal downstream, his small head barely visible above the brown, churning water. The temperature of the snowmelt-fed river was probably around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause hypothermia in minutes and drowning in a very short time. The mare's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. She ran along the bank following her baby, whinnying desperately as she watched him being carried away by the current. Her calls echoed across the river valley, a sound of pure maternal anguish that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She called dispatch on her radio while simultaneously starting her ATV to follow the foal's path downstream. Park Service protocol was clear about wildlife rescue situations. Human safety came first, and natural selection was generally allowed to take its course without human intervention. But as Sarah watched the tiny head bobbing in the dangerous current, she faced the kind of split-second decision that would define her career and challenge everything she believed about the balance between human responsibility and natural law. The foal was being swept toward a section of the river known as Devil's Rapids, where the water crashed over a series of large boulders before dropping into a deep pool. Adult animals had drowned in those rapids during high water years, and a 3-week-old foal had virtually no chance of survival if he reached that section of the river. Sarah had perhaps 3 minutes to make a decision that would either save a life or respect the natural order that governed wilderness preservation. The choice she made would set in motion a series of events that would attract national attention and change how the National Park Service approached wildlife rescue in crisis situations. As the foal disappeared around a bend in the river, Sarah made her decision and pushed her ATV to maximum speed, racing against time and current to reach a point where intervention might still be possible. Sarah's ATV bounced violently over the rough terrain as she raced along the river's edge, desperately trying to stay ahead of the foal who was being swept downstream by the relentless current. Her radio crackled with voices from park dispatch as word of the situation spread through the ranger network, but Sarah was too focused on the crisis to respond to the growing stream of questions and protocols. The foal's small head was still visible above the water, but Sarah could see that he was weakening rapidly. The ice-cold temperature was sapping his strength, and the current was too powerful for such a young animal to fight. He would reach Devil's Rapids in less than 2 minutes, and once he hit those boulder-strewn waters, any chance of survival would disappear. Sarah's training had prepared her for many emergency situations, but nothing quite like this. The National Park Service had strict policies about wildlife intervention. The natural order was to be preserved, even when it meant watching animals die from predation, disease, or accidents. Human interference was generally prohibited, except in cases where human activity had caused the problem. But this situation felt different to Sarah. The flooding that had displaced the Mustang family was partially due to human-caused climate change. The foal's fall had been an accident rather than natural selection, and most importantly, she had the skills and equipment that might make a rescue possible. Sarah was an experienced whitewater kayaker who had spent her college years as a river guide in Colorado. She understood water rescue techniques and had the physical conditioning necessary for attempting something as dangerous as entering flood stage rapids. Her ATV carried emergency equipment including rope, flotation devices, and first aid supplies. The decision point came when Sarah reached a section of the river where the bank was accessible and the current briefly slowed before accelerating toward the deadly rapids. This was her last chance to attempt an intervention, but doing so would violate park policy and put her own life at serious risk. Sarah's radio erupted with a direct order from Chief Ranger Mike Thompson. Williams, do not attempt any water rescue. That's a direct order. The water is too dangerous, and park policy is clear on wildlife intervention. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. Mike Thompson was not just her supervisor, but a mentor who had supported her career development and trusted her judgment in difficult situations. Disobeying his direct order could end her career with the Park Service and potentially result in criminal charges if her actions led to environmental damage or her own injury. But as Sarah watched the foal's desperate struggle against the current, she heard something that changed everything. The mares continued calling from upstream. The mother horse was still following along the bank, her whinnies becoming more urgent and desperate as she watched her baby being swept toward certain death. Sarah had studied animal behavior extensively, and she understood that the bond between mare and foal was one of the strongest connections in the natural world. The mother's anguish was genuine and profound, and losing her baby would likely affect her own survival prospects and ability to care for future offspring. In that moment, Sarah made a decision that went against her training, her orders, and her own safety instincts. She grabbed the emergency rope from her ATV, quickly secured one end to the vehicle's winch, and without allowing herself time to reconsider, dove into the frigid Yellowstone River. The shock of the ice-cold water hit her like a physical blow, but Sarah's adrenaline and determination carried her forward as she fought against the current toward the exhausted foal who was now less than 50 yards from the deadly rapids that would seal his fate. What happened next would either be remembered as a heroic rescue that saved 2 lives, or as a tragic miscalculation that cost both human and animal lives in a misguided attempt to interfere with nature's course. The shock of the 40-degree water hit Sarah like a sledgehammer, instantly numbing her extremities and making her gasp involuntarily. The current was far more powerful than it had appeared from the bank, and she immediately understood that she had perhaps 3 minutes before hypothermia would make coordinated movement impossible. The foal was about 30 yards ahead of her, his small head still above water, but his movements becoming increasingly weak and uncoordinated. Sarah could see the terror in his dark eyes as he struggled against the current that was pulling him inexorably toward Devil's Rapids. The sound of the churning water crashing over the boulder field ahead was growing louder with each passing second. Sarah's years of whitewater experience kicked in as she used a combination of swimming and strategic positioning to work her way across the current toward the foal. The safety rope attached to her ATV was providing just enough resistance to prevent her from being swept downstream, but it also created dangerous tension that could pull her underwater if she lost her footing. "Come on, little guy," Sarah called out to the foal as she fought her way closer. "We're going to get you out of this." The most dangerous moment came when Sarah reached the exhausted foal and attempted to secure him. Young horses are incredibly strong even when weakened, and the foal's instinctive panic response could easily pull them both underwater. Sarah had to time her approach perfectly, grabbing the foal during a brief moment when he stopped struggling and focused on staying afloat. Using techniques she'd learned from large animal rescue training, Sarah managed to position herself behind the foal and wrap her arms around his chest, supporting his head above water, while working to attach a secondary rope that would allow them both to be pulled to safety. The foal's body temperature was dangerously low, and she could feel his heartbeat racing from exhaustion and hypothermia. The sound of Devil's Rapids was now deafeningly close, and Sarah realized they were running out of time and river. With her radio waterlogged and useless, she had no way to communicate with her ATV's winch system, which meant their rescue depended entirely on her ability to work them both toward the bank, using nothing but the safety rope and her rapidly failing strength. That's when Sarah heard the sound that gave her hope, the rumble of approaching vehicles and the voices of other rangers who had arrived to assist with the rescue. Chief Ranger Mike Thompson's voice carried across the water, shouting instructions to the team that was setting up additional rope systems and rescue equipment. "Sarah, we've got you," Mike called out. "Work toward the rope team on your left." Ranger Tom Martinez, a specialist in technical rescue operations, had rappelled down the riverbank with additional equipment and was positioned to assist with the final phase of the rescue. Working together with Sarah, they managed to secure the foal in a specially designed animal rescue harness that would allow him to be safely lifted from the water. The actual extraction took another 15 minutes of coordinated effort as the rescue team carefully pulled both Sarah and the foal from the rushing water. The foal was unconscious by the time they reached the bank, his body temperature critically low and his breathing shallow and irregular. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the park's veterinarian, was waiting with emergency warming equipment and medical supplies. Her immediate assessment revealed that the foal was in severe hypothermia and shock, but still alive with a chance for recovery if they could warm him gradually and support his vital functions. Sarah, meanwhile, was experiencing the early stages of hypothermia herself and needed immediate medical attention. As the rescue team worked to save both lives, Chief Ranger Thompson faced the challenge of documenting an incident that had violated park policy but had potentially saved the life of an endangered wild animal. The rescue was complete, but the real challenges were just beginning as both the foal and Sarah would need intensive care to recover from their ordeal in the deadly waters of the Yellowstone River. The next 48 hours at Yellowstone's Wildlife Rehabilitation Facility became a critical period that would determine whether Sarah's controversial rescue had saved a life or merely delayed the inevitable. The foal, whom the veterinary team had named Rio for the river that nearly claimed his life, was fighting for survival in ways that challenged everything Dr. Jennifer Walsh knew about equine hypothermia recovery. Sarah had been treated for moderate hypothermia at the park's medical facility and released after 6 hours of warming and observation. Despite Chief Ranger Mike Thompson's serious concerns about her violation of park policy, he had agreed to postpone any disciplinary action until Rio's condition stabilized and the full circumstances could be properly reviewed. Dr. Walsh, a veterinarian with 15 years of experience in wild animal rehabilitation, had never treated a Mustang foal for such severe hypothermia and water trauma. Rio's core body temperature had dropped to 92 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 10 degrees below normal, and his lungs showed signs of water aspiration that could lead to pneumonia. His survival will depend on the next 24 hours, Dr. Walsh explained to Sarah as they watched Rio lying motionless under warming blankets in the rehabilitation facility. Young horses can recover from hypothermia better than adults, but the combination of cold water exposure and near drowning creates complications we rarely see. The most challenging aspect of Rio's care was the fact that he was a wild animal who had never had human contact before the rescue. Unlike domestic horses, who were accustomed to human handling, Rio's stress responses could actually hinder his recovery by elevating his heart rate and preventing the deep rest his body needed to heal. Sarah found herself spending most of her off-duty hours at the rehabilitation facility, not just because she felt responsible for Rio's well-being, but because the foal seemed to respond positively to her presence. Dr. Walsh had noticed that Rio's vital signs stabilized whenever Sarah was nearby, suggesting that some kind of bond had formed during their shared trauma in the river. "It's unusual, but not unprecedented," Dr. Walsh observed as Sarah sat quietly beside Rio's recovery stall. "Sometimes animals form attachments to their rescuers, especially when the rescue involved physical contact during a life-threatening situation." The breakthrough in Rio's recovery came on the second day when he stood up for the first time since the rescue. His legs were unsteady and his movements uncertain, but he was clearly alert and responsive. More importantly, he showed interest in the specialized full milk formula that Dr. Walsh had been trying to get him to accept. "This is a very good sign," Dr. Walsh told Sarah, as they watched Rio take his first tentative sips of the formula. "His appetite returning means his body systems are functioning normally, and his energy levels are beginning to recover." But Rio's improving health created a new dilemma for park management. As a wild Mustang, he legally belonged to the Bureau of Land Management, which had jurisdiction over wild horse populations in the region. The BLM would need to make decisions about Rio's future that balanced wildlife preservation with practical considerations about his ability to survive in the wild. The situation became more complex when Rio's mother was located by park rangers about 5 miles downstream from the rescue site. The mare had continued searching for her foal for 2 days, and her distressed calling could be heard echoing through the river valley. Reuniting them would be ideal for both animals, but Rio's current weakness made an immediate release potentially dangerous. Dr. Walsh proposed a gradual rehabilitation program that would allow Rio to regain his strength while maintaining his wild instincts. "Our goal is to return him to his mother and the wild herd as quickly as possible, but he needs another week of medical monitoring to ensure full recovery." Sarah's role in Rio's ongoing care had created an unexpected situation where a park ranger was intimately involved in wildlife rehabilitation, a circumstance that would require careful handling to maintain both professional standards and the foal's best interests. The controversy surrounding the rescue was growing as word spread through the park service and media outlets. But for Sarah, the only thing that mattered was Rio's continued improvement and eventual return to the wild freedom that defined his species. After 6 days of intensive care, Rio had made a remarkable recovery that surprised even Dr. Walsh with its speed and completeness. The young foal was eating regularly, moving with normal coordination, and showing the alert, energetic behavior typical of healthy Mustang foals. The time had come for the most crucial test of the rescue's success, reuniting Rio with his mother and determining whether he could survive in the wild. The reunion process required careful planning and coordination between multiple agencies. Sarah worked with BLM wild horse specialist Maria Rodriguez and Dr. Walsh to develop a protocol that would maximize the chances of successful reunification while minimizing stress on both animals. "The mare has been calling for her foal for nearly a week," Maria explained as the team prepared for the reunion attempt. "She's remained in the general area, which suggests a strong maternal bond, but we won't know if she'll accept him back until we actually bring them together." The plan involved transporting Rio in a specialized horse trailer to the area where his mother had been observed, then conducting a careful, monitored introduction. If the reunion was successful, Rio would be released immediately. If there were problems, he would need to be returned to the rehabilitation facility for additional care. Sarah had requested permission to participate in the reunion, despite Chief Ranger Thompson's concerns about her continued involvement in what was already a controversial situation. Her bond with Rio had become undeniable. The foal clearly trusted her and remained calmer in her presence than with other caretakers. Sarah, I need you to understand that your career is still under review, Chief Ranger Thompson told her privately before the reunion attempt. The Park Service is taking your policy violation seriously, but they're also considering the outcome and the circumstances. How this reunion goes will factor into their final decision. The transport to the reunion site went smoothly, with Rio showing no signs of distress during the short trailer ride. His physical condition was excellent, and Dr. Walsh's final examination confirmed that he had suffered no lasting effects from his ordeal in the river. The moment of truth came when Rio's mother spotted the transport trailer from about 200 yards away. Her immediate response was encouraging. She approached at a trot, calling to her foal with the urgent vocalizations that had echoed through the valley for days. Rio's response was equally immediate and powerful. He began calling back to his mother from inside the trailer, his whinnying becoming increasingly excited as she approached. When the trailer door was opened, Rio burst out and ran directly toward his mother without hesitation. The reunion itself was everything the team had hoped for. The mare immediately began nuzzling and examining her foal, checking him over with the thoroughness that only a mother could provide. Rio's response was to nurse immediately, confirming that their bond remained strong despite the week-long separation. "This is exactly what we wanted to see," Maria Rodriguez observed as the mother and foal reestablished their connection. "The maternal bond has remained intact, and Rio shows no fear or hesitation about returning to wild behavior." But the reunion created an unexpected emotional response in Sarah. Watching Rio return to his mother and prepare to disappear back into the wild, she felt a profound sense of loss mixed with satisfaction. The foal she had risked her career to save was exactly where he belonged, but letting him go was more difficult than she had anticipated. Dr. Walsh noticed Sarah's emotional response and understood what she was experiencing. "It's normal to feel attached after what you went through together," she said quietly. "But this is the best possible outcome. Rio is healthy, wild, and back with his family." The successful reunion was documented by park photographers and would become part of the official record supporting Sarah's decision to violate park policy. Her split-second choice to dive into the deadly river had resulted in the best possible outcome for all involved. As Sarah watched Rio and his mother disappear into the Yellowstone wilderness, she knew that her decision had been vindicated. But she also understood that the broader implications of her actions would continue to influence park policy for years to come. 6 months after Sarah Williams dove into the frigid Yellowstone River to save a drowning Mustang foal, her actions had sparked a comprehensive review of National Park Service wildlife intervention policies that would influence conservation efforts across the entire park system. The controversial rescue that had initially threatened her career had instead become a catalyst for positive change in how park management balanced human responsibility with natural law. The disciplinary review of Sarah's actions concluded with an official commendation rather than punishment. Park Service Director James Morrison personally presented Sarah with the agency's award for exceptional service, recognizing that her split-second decision had not only saved Rio's life, but had also generated valuable insights into wildlife rescue protocols. Ranger Williams demonstrated the kind of courage and compassion that exemplifies the best values of the National Park Service, Director Morrison said during the awards ceremony. Her actions reminded us that our mission to preserve wildlife sometimes requires us to take calculated risks to protect individual animals whose survival benefits entire ecosystems. The policy changes that emerged from Rio's rescue were implemented across all national parks. The new guidelines created a framework for emergency wildlife intervention that balanced respect for natural processes with recognition that human-caused environmental changes sometimes required human solutions. Rangers received additional training in animal rescue techniques, and emergency equipment was upgraded to support wildlife rescue operations. Chief Ranger Mike Thompson, who had initially opposed Sarah's actions, became one of the strongest advocates for the new policies. Sarah taught us that sometimes the most important leadership decisions happen in moments when there's no time to consult manuals or wait for authorization, he reflected during a training session for new Rangers. Her judgment call saved a life and improved our ability to serve our mission. Rio's story had attracted national attention that extended far beyond park management. The rescue footage, captured by tourists and park cameras, had been viewed millions of times on social media, inspiring conservation awareness and support for wild horse protection programs. The Bureau of Land Management reported increased volunteer applications and donations to wild horse preservation efforts directly attributed to Rio's story. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's documentation of Rio's recovery had contributed to veterinary literature on wild animal rehabilitation, particularly in cases involving hypothermia and water trauma. Her research was being used by wildlife rehabilitation centers across the country to improve survival rates for animals in similar situations. Maria Rodriguez tracked Rio and his mother for months after the reunion, documenting their successful reintegration into the wild herd. Rio shows no behavioral differences from other foals his age, she reported. He's grown into a healthy, strong young horse who demonstrates all the survival instincts necessary for wild Mustang life. The broader impact extended to Sarah's career development. Her combination of courage, practical skills, and deep understanding of wildlife conservation had attracted attention from conservation organizations nationwide. She was offered positions with wildlife rescue organizations, environmental advocacy groups, and research institutions, but chose to remain with the National Park Service as a specialist in emergency wildlife intervention. Sarah often returned to the section of the Yellowstone River where Rio's rescue had taken place, reflecting on how one moment of decision had created ripple effects that continued expanding. Her actions had proven that individual choices could influence policy, inspire public support for conservation, and demonstrate that humans could intervene in natural processes in ways that strengthened rather than weakened at ecosystem preservation. The rescue had also taught Sarah important lessons about the connection between human responsibility and environmental stewardship. We created the conditions that put Rio in danger through climate change and habitat disruption, she explained to visitors during educational programs. Taking responsibility for helping him was acknowledging our role in creating the problem and our obligation to be part of the solution. Rio's story had become a symbol of hope for conservation efforts worldwide, proving that individual acts of courage could lead to systemic changes that benefited entire species and ecosystems. If Rio's incredible rescue story inspired you, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more amazing tales of wildlife conservation and human courage. Share this video with someone who believes in taking action to protect wildlife, because Sarah and Rio's story proves that sometimes the most important conservation decisions happen in split seconds when someone chooses courage over caution. Tell us in the comments, would you have made the same decision Sarah did? What does Rio's story teach you about the balance between human intervention and natural law? Your thoughts help keep the conversation alive about our responsibility to protect the wildlife that shares our planet. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the most significant conservation victories begin with one person's refusal to walk away when an animal needs help, proving that individual courage can create lasting change for entire species.
He wasn't supposed to survive the night. 3 dogs, a German shepherd with eyes like embers, a scarred Rottweiler, and a lean, restless Doberman, chained in a rotting pen on the edge of Clearwater Bay. Their ribs showed through matted fur, their breath shallow in the damp midnight air. From the darkness, a lone Marine stepped through the weeds, back from a war no one had welcomed him home from. No one knew what he would find. No one understood how close these animals were to being lost forever. But this isn't a story about cruelty. It's a story about redemption, about the faith that God plants in our hearts when all seems broken. What follows will test your spirit and renew it. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and if you believe God sends angels in the shape of dogs, hit subscribe, because this story will live in you long after it ends. The coastal town of Clearwater Bay, Florida, was sweltering under the late summer sun. Heat shimmered above the asphalt roads, and the air carried the mingled scent of salt from the nearby shore and diesel from the bus station. Seagulls cried overhead, as if impatient for the afternoon tide, while palm fronds swayed lazily in the humid breeze. At the far end of the station, a long-distance bus hissed as it idled, waiting for passengers to climb aboard. Mason Cole stood just beyond the shade of the ticket booth, his broad shoulders tense beneath a faded olive-green t-shirt. At 36, Mason had the steady posture of a man who had learned discipline the hard way, 4 years serving as a U.S. Marine abroad, countless days and nights where routine meant survival. His sun-browned skin bore the fine lines of someone who had squinted into harsh light for far too long, and a faint scar crossed the bridge of his nose, a silent token from a mission gone wrong. His deep-set hazel eyes rarely revealed his thoughts, but they carried a quiet watchfulness, as if always assessing the next move. In his hands was a small, weather-worn parcel wrapped in brown paper, the corners softened by travel. It had arrived that morning at the temporary lodging where he was staying in Jacksonville, sent by Sarah Bennett, a name he hadn't heard in years. Sarah had once been his next-door neighbor in Clearwater Bay, and was now the town's most trusted veterinarian, tall and willowy, with sun-bleached hair perpetually tied back in a practical knot. Sarah's voice was calm, even when the situation wasn't. Her kindness toward animals was legendary in the community, but it had been forged in hardship. Losing her family's ranch to a hurricane in her teens taught her the fragility of life and the value of every creature in her care. Mason remembered her as someone who never looked away from suffering, no matter how unpleasant. He'd assumed the package might be a friendly note welcoming him home after deployment, but when he sat on the edge of his bunk that morning and carefully tore the wrapping, he found no cheerful letter inside. Instead, there were plastic sleeves filled with veterinary reports, grainy photographs, and handwritten notes in Sarah's tidy, looping script. Each page bore the names of 3 dogs, Rex, Duke, and Brutus. Rex, a 7-year-old German shepherd, had been Mason's steadfast companion since before his military days. Large and powerfully built, with a sable coat that glinted bronze in sunlight, Rex's amber eyes reflected intelligence and calm authority. Even among other dogs, he carried himself like a leader, never brash, but decisive. Duke, a 5-year-old Doberman pinscher, was lean and muscular, his black and tan markings sharp as if inked with precision. He had an almost theatrical way of tilting his head when listening, but behind that charm was a cautious nature, shaped by early skittishness Mason had helped him overcome through patience. Brutus, the youngest at 3, was a solidly built Rottweiler with a broad chest and a surprisingly gentle gaze. His glossy black coat and mahogany markings gave him a regal look, though his slightly crooked left ear, an old injury from rough play, made him appear endearingly approachable. Brutus was loyal to the bone, but his heart was easily wounded if treated harshly. Mason had left all 3 under the care of Linda Graves, a woman in her 40s who had been a close friend of his late wife. At the time, entrusting the dogs to her had seemed reasonable. Linda had owned dogs before, and she had offered, unprompted, to look after them until Mason's return. He remembered her as a charismatic figure with a ready laugh, and a talent for making people feel indebted to her, though her temper could flare when things didn't go her way. Now, Sarah's packet told another story. The reports detailed malnutrition, weight loss in all 3 dogs, untreated skin infections, and signs of prolonged confinement. The photos cut deeper. Rex standing behind a warped wooden fence, his ribs faintly visible. Duke lying on a patch of dirt with no shade. Brutus with a raw patch on his flank, where fur had rubbed away against a chain. Sarah's notes were blunt. These conditions are consistent with neglect. They are not safe. Mason swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the sticky heat. He remembered the day he had left for deployment. Rex pressing his head into Mason's thigh, Duke pacing in anxious circles, Brutus whining low as if he sensed something was wrong. He had promised them he would be back. A loud hiss from the bus's hydraulic brakes broke his thoughts. Mason climbed aboard and slid into a seat near the back, the package still clutched in his hands. The interior smelled faintly of coffee and vinyl seats baked by the sun. The driver, a wiry man with deep creases around his eyes and salt and pepper hair peeking from under a cap, glanced at him in the rearview mirror as they pulled away from the station. "Headed home, huh?" the driver asked, in a voice that carried the rasp of too many cigarettes. "Yeah," Mason replied simply. The man's eyes flicked back to the road. "You hear about those 3 dogs down in Clearwater? Folks say they've been locked up in some old kennel for a week straight. No food, no water. Shameful." Mason's jaw tightened, but he kept his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. Flat stretches of coastal scrub, occasional flashes of the glittering Gulf. "I hadn't heard," he said, though the knot in his gut told him he already knew exactly which 3 dogs the man meant. The bus rattled along the 2-lane highway, tires thumping over expansion joints. Mason rested the parcel on his knees and began leafing through the contents again, page by page. Veterinary bills unpaid, weight loss charts, photographs that seemed to sap the color from the day. His thumb stopped on a final note from Sarah, paper slightly crumpled as if it had been handled more than once. The note was clipped to a single photograph of Rex. The German Shepherd was peering through a gap in the kennel boards, the afternoon light catching just one of his eyes. It was the same eye Mason had looked into countless times before, an eye that once reflected trust, readiness, and that unspoken bond between a soldier and his canine. Now it looked tired, empty. For a moment, the rumble of the bus and the distant crash of waves seemed to fade. Mason's grip tightened until the edges of the photograph curled under his fingers. The driver called out that they'd reach Clearwater Bay by nightfall, but Mason had already made up his mind. He wouldn't wait for daylight. He was going to get them back tonight, no matter what stood in his way. Clearwater Bay had slipped into evening by the time Mason stepped off the bus. The air was still thick with humidity, but the fierce heat had softened into a heavy, salt-laden haze that clung to his skin. The street lamps along Harbor Lane blinked to life one by one, casting puddles of amber light on the cracked pavement. Mason's boots crunched against the gravel shoulder as he took the long way toward the house he had once called home, avoiding the brighter, busier main road. The neighborhood was quieter than he remembered. No children playing catch in the yards, no screen doors slamming, just the distant rumble of the ocean beyond the dunes. The house appeared at the end of a narrow, sandy drive, its white siding now painted a sterile gray. The cheerful blue shutters his late wife had chosen were gone, replaced by flat black ones that made the windows look like unblinking eyes. Mason slowed his steps, scanning the facade. The porch swing was missing. The potted hibiscus that once greeted visitors were nowhere in sight. Through the front window he caught a glimpse of an empty wall where a framed wedding photo used to hang. Linda Graves had stripped the place of every trace of the family that once lived here. Linda was in her mid-40s, with ash-blonde hair that she kept styled in loose waves that always looked deliberate but never windblown. She was of medium build, with a penchant for tailored clothes and sharp accessories, the sort that spoke of someone who wanted to be noticed in a crowd. Her smile could be disarming, but it rarely reached her pale blue eyes. Mason remembered that she had a knack for inserting herself into situations where sympathy could be leveraged into influence. That skill had helped her gain the trust of neighbors, and it had been enough for him to believe she would care for Rex, Duke, and Brutus while he was away. Mason didn't approach the front door. He knew Linda well enough to suspect she would be prepared for visitors there. Instead, he turned down the narrow side path, his boots brushing against overgrown weeds that snagged at his jeans. The path smelled faintly of damp soil and rust. When he reached the back gate, he paused. The once sturdy fence sagged in places, its boards warped, and the old iron latch mottled with corrosion. Pushing it open released a drawn-out creak that echoed in the stillness. The backyard was a shadow of what it used to be. The grass was patchy, replaced in places by stubborn weeds that had grown waist-high along the edges. The citrus tree that once offered shade in the heat of summer was barren, its branches brittle and bare. A pile of sun-bleached lawn furniture leaned against the fence, forgotten. Mason's eyes moved to the far corner, where the old kennel had stood. The roof was covered by a heavy tarp that sagged in the middle, rainwater pooled in its folds. Then he heard it. a sharp, angry voice cutting through the quiet. "Get back! I said get back!" The words were followed by a heavy thud and the unmistakable clink of chain links. Mason froze, his body going still like it had in combat zones when he caught a sound that didn't belong. He stepped closer, the soles of his boots muffled by the thick weeds. Another voice filled the air, this one lower, rougher, accompanied by the deep, distressed bark of a dog. The sound tightened something in Mason's chest. He took the last few steps in a crouch, coming up along the side of the kennel. The tarp was fastened with a frayed bungee cord, its hooks buried in the splintered wood. Mason slipped his fingers under the edge and yanked it back in one motion. The sight hit him harder than he expected. Rex stood first in line, chained to a short length of metal link that barely allowed him to stand and turn. His coat, once full and glossy, was matted along his flanks, his ribs faintly visible beneath. Yet, even in his weakened state, Rex's amber eyes met Mason's with a flicker of recognition, one that shifted from disbelief to a desperate, silent plea. To his right, Duke lay curled on a bed of straw that had long since turned to dust, his tan markings dulled under a layer of grime. The proud arch of his neck was lowered, his ears pinned back, his body trembling in slow, shallow waves. Brutus, heavier but no better off, was sprawled against the back wall of the kennel, his head lifted slightly at the sight of Mason, his dark eyes softening before fatigue pulled them halfway closed again. A patch of fur was missing along his side, raw skin visible where the chain had rubbed. And standing over them, her face flushed and jaw tight, was Linda. In her right hand she gripped a leather riding crop, the handle worn smooth. She was dressed neatly, khaki capri pants and a pale blouse, but the set of her shoulders was rigid, her stance defensive. "Move back!" she snapped again, jabbing the air near Brutus. The dog shrank against the wooden walls. Mason didn't speak right away. His gaze swept over each of his dogs, cataloging every wound, every sign of neglect. He saw the shallow water bowl in the corner, bone dry. He noticed the empty food dish overturned against the wall, the flies clustering along the edges. His hands curled into fists, but his voice, when it came, was steady. "What the hell is this, Linda?" She turned at the sound of his voice, surprise flashing across her face before it hardened into something guarded. "Mason, you're back early." Her eyes flicked toward the open tarp, then back to him. "They're fine, just correcting some behavior issues." "They're chained in filth," Mason said, stepping forward, the boards creaking under his weight. Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. "They've been trouble since you left. Rex tries to jump the fence. Duke barks at all hours. Brutus chews anything he can find. You can't just let animals run wild." She raised the crop slightly as if to punctuate her words, though the dogs didn't flinch so much as brace, as if they'd learned to expect it. Mason took another step forward, placing himself between her and the dogs. "You said you'd take care of them," he said, his voice low. "I am taking care of them," she replied sharply. "You don't know what it's been like. You weren't here." Mason didn't answer. Instead, he reached down and unhooked the first chain from Rex's collar. The metal links fell to the floor with a dull rattle. Rex stepped forward hesitantly, pressing his head into Mason's leg. Mason moved to Duke, then Brutus, freeing each in turn. The air seemed to shift as the chains dropped away, a faint stirring of hope beneath the heavy scent of neglect. Linda's eyes narrowed. "Where do you think you're taking them?" "They're mine now. You left them with me." Mason's gaze was unyielding. "I left them with a caretaker, not a jailer." The leather crop hung limply at her side now, her knuckles white around the handle. "You walk out that gate with them, Mason, and you'll regret it." He didn't respond. Rex, Duke, and Brutus clustered close to him, their movements slow but deliberate. He guided them toward the back gate, one hand resting on Rex's shoulder, the other keeping Duke and Brutus close. The metal latch groaned as he opened it, and the cool breath of the sea rolled in from beyond the fence. They stepped out into the dim light together, the night folding around them like a shield. The night had settled deep over Clearwater Bay, wrapping the neighborhood in a heavy stillness, broken only by the soft rustle of palm fronds and the faint crash of waves in the distance. Mason stood inside the dilapidated kennel, the smell of damp straw and rusted metal thick in the air. The three dogs huddled against the warped wooden walls, their bodies tense, but their eyes, especially Rex's, alive with the faintest flicker of hope. The dim yellow light from a bare bulb overhead cast long shadows, stretching across the floor like the memory of chains that had bound them for far too long. Mason crouched first beside Rex. The German Shepherd was taller than Mason remembered, his frame still carrying the build of a leader despite the weight he'd lost. His sable coat was tangled, dust dulling its natural sheen. When Mason's hands worked the stiff clasp of the chain from around his neck, Rex didn't move at first. He simply stood still, watching, as though afraid this moment might dissolve into another disappointment. Then, with a soft chuff, he stepped forward and pressed his head hard into Mason's chest. The contact was solid, grounding. Mason's palm came to rest on Rex's head, his fingers feeling the familiar contours of the dog's skull. Duke was next. The Doberman's sleek body trembled as Mason approached, his head turned slightly, as if unsure whether to trust the hand reaching for him. Duke's ears twitched at the faint scrape of metal as Mason released the latch on his chain. The moment the collar slackened, Duke drew a shaky breath, his dark eyes meeting Mason's for the first time. There was caution there, but also recognition. And when Mason gave the faintest nod, Duke inched forward, resting his muzzle briefly against Mason's knee before stepping aside. Brutus, the Rottweiler, lay sprawled in the corner, his breath slow and deliberate. Mason could see the chafed skin beneath the collar, the mark of days, maybe weeks, without relief. The clasp was stiff, but it finally gave way with a metallic snap. Brutus raised his head, sniffed Mason's hand, then leaned into it with surprising weight for his weakened state. His tail gave a single slow wag before he pushed himself to his feet. Behind him, Linda's voice cut sharply through the moment. "You don't understand, Mason," she said, her tone pitched high but trying to mask unease. "They don't listen. They fight with other dogs. Rex tried to bite the mailman. I've only done what's necessary to keep them in line." She stood in the open doorway, one hand braced against the frame, the other still clutching the leather riding crop, though it now dangled loosely at her side. Mason didn't turn to look at her. His focus remained on guiding the dogs out of the kennel, one hand resting lightly on Rex's back as they moved toward the exit. Linda stepped forward, her sandals scraping on the wooden floor. "You think I wanted this? I've fed them. I've kept a roof over their heads. They're chained in filth," Mason said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made her stop mid-step. Linda's eyes narrowed. "You were gone for years. They're mine now. You left them with me." Only then did Mason glance over his shoulder. His expression was controlled, but there was no mistaking the hard edge in his eyes. "I left them with someone I believed would care for them. I didn't leave them with a jailer." The words landed heavy, their quiet tone cutting sharper than a shout. Linda's mouth opened, perhaps to argue, but Mason had already turned back to the dogs. Rex walked close at his side, Duke and Brutus following in a loose formation behind. The dogs moved slowly, their paws padding over the cracked concrete floor. Mason reached the open threshold, stepping aside to let each of them out into the cooler night air. Rex paused at the doorway, glancing back toward the kennel, as though to confirm he was truly leaving. Duke's nose lifted slightly, catching the scent of salt carried on the breeze. Brutus lingered the longest, looking from Mason to Linda and back again, before finally stepping out with deliberate slowness. Linda's voice rose one last time, sharp and ringing in the night air. "You'll regret this, Mason. You have no home for them, no plan. They'll be back here before the month's out." Mason turned his head just enough that she could see the set of his jaw. "If they ever come back here, it will be because I failed them, and that's not going to happen." For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind moving through the grass. Mason gave a brief signal with his hand, and Rex moved forward down the narrow path toward the gate. Duke and Brutus followed without hesitation now, their earlier wariness replaced by a quiet resolve. The back gate groaned as Mason pushed it open. The dogs stepped out one by one, their shadows stretching long in the glow of the street lamp beyond. The night felt wider, freer. Mason let the gate fall shut behind them with a muted clang, the sound carrying a finality he didn't bother to hide. They started down the sandy path that led away from the property, the hum of the ocean growing louder with each step. Mason kept Rex close, occasionally resting his hand on the German Shepherd's neck. Duke ranged just a little ahead, sniffing the breeze, while Brutus walked on Mason's other side, his head level with the Marine's hand. As they moved away from the house, Mason caught sight of Mrs. Evelyn Carver, an elderly neighbor with short silver hair and sharp eyes behind thick glasses, standing at her porch across the street. She wore a faded blue robe and clutched a mug of tea, steam curling into the humid night. Evelyn had always been a quiet observer of the block, the kind of woman who missed nothing but spoke only when she believed her words mattered. She gave Mason a long, knowing look, her gaze flicking to the three dogs, then back to him. Without a word, she gave a small nod and stepped back inside, the porch light snapping off a second later. Mason kept walking, the sound of his boots muffled by the soft sand. He didn't look back. The kennel was behind them, and for tonight, that was enough. The streets of Clearwater Bay were quiet under the pale wash of the moon, save for the rhythmic hum of Mason's truck as it rolled along the coastal road. The three dogs, Rex, Duke, and Brutus, lay in the back seat, too drained to do more than shift occasionally as the tires hit the uneven patches of asphalt. Salt-scented air streamed through the half-open windows, mingling with the faint smell of wet fur and old chain. Mason kept one eye on the road and the other on the rearview mirror, where the dogs' silhouettes moved subtly with each turn. He knew they needed more than food and rest. They needed someone to document what had been done to them, someone whose word could not be ignored. Sarah Bennett's veterinary clinic sat at the edge of town, a low, single-story building with a tin roof that glinted faintly in the light of the street lamps. The sign out front, painted by hand, the letters Bennett Animal Care, slightly faded from the sun, was a reminder that Sarah had never sought grandeur. She had chosen this spot because it was close to the fishing docks, where stray cats and half-starved dogs often wandered in search of scraps. When Mason pulled into the gravel lot, the lights inside were still on despite the late hour. Sarah emerged before he had even opened the truck door. Tall and slender, with a purposeful stride that made her loose braids swing against the back of her navy blue scrubs, she carried herself like someone accustomed to solving problems quickly. Her face was framed by wisps of sun-bleached hair that had escaped the braid, and her gray eyes had the focused calm of a person who had learned early in life that panic never helped anyone. Mason remembered that she'd lost her family's ranch to a hurricane when she was 17, an event that had left her with a deep-rooted sense of responsibility for any creature in her care. "Mason Cole," she said, her voice low but edged with relief. "I thought you were still overseas." Her gaze flicked past him to the truck, and the easy smile she had been wearing fell away. "Bring them inside, now." Inside the clinic, the smell of antiseptic was sharp, mingling with the faint tang of the ocean that drifted in whenever the door opened. Sarah led them to an examination room painted in muted sea green, the kind of color meant to soothe. She moved with efficient precision, her hands gentle but firm as she examined each dog in turn. Rex stood tall despite his fatigue, allowing her to check his ears, teeth, and paws without protest. Sarah's eyes narrowed at the raw patch around his neck, where the chain had bitten into the skin. Duke trembled on the steel table, his ribs visible under the sleek coat, but Sarah murmured to him in a tone so steady that he finally stopped shaking. Brutus was the heaviest, his weight making a dull thump as he settled onto the table, but his eyes softened under Sarah's quiet attention. She noted the missing fur on his side, the stiffness in his gait, the way he winced when she palpated his back. "They've been underfed for weeks, maybe longer," she said at last, her voice clipped in the way it got when she was angry. "Old wounds, new ones, and some of these marks," she pointed to a faded bruise on Rex's flank, "are consistent with being struck." She looked up at Mason, her expression hard. "If you're planning to take this further, I'll put everything in my report." Before Mason could respond, the bell above the clinic door jingled. A small, wiry woman stepped inside, pausing when she saw Mason. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy bun, and she wore a faded denim jacket over a floral dress. She carried herself like someone unused to barging in anywhere, her fingers worrying the strap of a worn canvas satchel slung over her shoulder. "Mason?" she asked hesitantly. "Yeah," he replied, turning to face her. "My name's Carla James," she said, offering a quick, almost nervous glance towards Sarah before looking back at Mason. "I used to work for Linda, cleaning, helping with errands. She broke off, opening her satchel and pulling out a small, battered voice recorder. "I think you need to hear this." Carla set the recorder on the counter and pressed play. The sound that filled the room was grainy but unmistakable, the sharp, venomous tone of Linda's voice. "You're useless. Just a burden. Nothing but a drain on me. If you were gone tomorrow, no one would even notice. In the background came the muffled whimper of a dog, followed by the metallic rattle of chain and another weaker cry. Carla's hands tightened on the strap of her bag. That was from last month. I couldn't stand it anymore, so I quit. But I kept this. I thought, maybe you'd be able to do something. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Mason stared at the recorder, his jaw tightening. His fingers curled slowly into fists, the leather of his gloves creaking under the pressure. But his eyes, when he finally looked up, were steady, clearer than they had been all evening. Sarah watched him for a long moment, then gave a short, decisive nod. You've got what you need now, Mason. Medical evidence, a witness, and a recording. That's more than most cases ever start with. Mason exhaled, a controlled breath that carried the weight of resolve rather than rage. Then we start, he said simply. The courthouse in Clearwater Bay stood like an old sentinel at the corner of Harbor and Main, its weathered white columns and chipped marble steps telling the story of decades of trials and verdicts. On the morning of the hearing, the air was cool for Florida, a thin mist curling above the Gulf before the sun burned it away. Mason parked his truck a block away, choosing to walk the rest of the distance with Rex, Duke, and Brutus left safely at Sarah's clinic. He wanted them close to safety, not in the tense air of a courtroom. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of varnished wood and paper, both worn and fresh. The walls bore framed photographs of past judges, their black robes frozen mid-century in sepia tones. Mason stepped through the heavy oak doors into courtroom 2, his boots making a muted thud on the polished floor. Rows of benches held a scattering of townspeople, some curious, others whispering quietly as they recognized him. He wore a clean pressed shirt, the dark fabric setting off the faint tan lines at his neck and wrists. In his left hand, he carried a small cloth bag. At the front, Prosecutor Daniel Whitaker arranged files at the long oak table. Whitaker was a man in his early 40s with sharp features, neat dark hair combed back from a high forehead, and a measured, deliberate way of moving that suggested he preferred precision over theatrics. Known for building airtight cases, he rarely raised his voice, but had a way of making silence work in his favor. Across from him sat Linda Graves, her hair styled in perfect loose waves, dressed in a pale pink blouse and cream slacks, as if the right outfit might soften her image. Her lawyer, Richard Kessler, a tall man with a sandy beard and a slightly rumpled navy suit, leaned toward her, speaking in low tones. Kessler had the reputation of being resourceful, but sometimes too eager to push sympathy over substance. Judge Meredith Holloway, a woman in her late 50s with silver hair pulled into a smooth chignon, entered promptly at 9. Her steady brown eyes took in the room without hurry, the kind of gaze that weighed every detail before deciding its worth. The clerk's voice echoed as the case was called. State of Florida versus Linda Graves, charges of animal cruelty and misappropriation of funds. Whitaker began, laying out the sequence of events with calm precision. He presented veterinary reports from Sarah Bennett, complete with photographs of the injuries and malnutrition in Rex, Duke, and Brutus. Enlarged images were projected onto a screen, showing close-ups of raw skin, protruding ribs, and the worn, corroded chains. Each photograph was dated, matched to Sarah's report, and authenticated by her sworn affidavit. Then came the audio recording from Carla James. The grainy sound of Linda's voice filled the room. "You're useless, just a burden, nothing but a drain on me. If you were gone tomorrow, no one would even notice." The muffled whimpers and rattling chains in the background left the courtroom unusually still. Whitaker let the silence settle for several seconds before speaking again. Mason's turn came next. He approached the witness stand with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far harsher trials in his life. After being sworn in, he set the small cloth bag on the rail before him and untied the drawstring. From inside, he lifted a frayed leather collar, its once bright brass buckle now dulled with age. "This," Mason said, holding it up for the court to see, "was Rex's collar. I bought it for him when he was 6 months old. He wore it the day I left for deployment and the day I found him again, chained in Linda's yard. I'm not showing you this for pity. I'm showing you because it's proof of something that mattered, a bond that survived 4 years apart, even when trust was being beaten out of him." Whitaker asked him about the arrangement he had made with Linda before leaving. Mason explained that she had agreed to care for the dogs with the understanding that he would cover expenses, Bank transfers confirmed he had sent a monthly stipend labeled dog care. When it was Kessler's turn, he leaned into the defense that Linda had already rehearsed. She claimed the funds had been used for dog-related expenses, citing the need for fencing, premium food, and medical treatments. She painted herself as overwhelmed, saying the dogs had been aggressive and difficult to manage. Whitaker waited until she was finished before sliding a thick sheaf of papers across to the clerk for display. "These," he said, "are the defendant's bank statements for the last 18 months. A screen lit up with itemized entries: boutique clothing stores, a resort in Key West, airline tickets to New York, spa packages. Not a single purchase from a veterinary supplier, pet store, or feed mill appeared on the list." Linda's composure faltered. She shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening on the edge of the table. Kessler murmured something to her, but she kept her gaze fixed ahead. Judge Holloway's voice broke the tension. "The evidence presented shows clear and repeated neglect, resulting in harm to the animals in question. Further, it demonstrates a misappropriation of funds intended for their care, with no credible justification." She paused, her eyes sweeping from the prosecutor to the defense. "For these reasons, the court sentences the defendant, Linda Graves, to 8 years in state prison without eligibility for early release, for the combined charges of animal cruelty and financial fraud." The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Linda's face drained of color. 2 uniformed deputies approached, one of them, a stout man with kind eyes, placing a gentle but firm hand on her arm. As she was led away, Mason stayed still, his hands resting on the worn collar. He didn't gloat, didn't smile. The only shift in his expression was a faint loosening around his jaw, as if a weight had shifted from his shoulders onto the solid ground beneath him. In the gallery, Carla James exhaled, her shoulders slumping in relief. Sarah Bennett, seated a few rows back, met Mason's eyes and gave him a nod. Short, steady. The kind of gesture that said, "We did what needed to be done." The afternoon sun hung low over Clearwater Bay, casting a golden light that made the waves glitter beyond the dunes. Mason stepped out of the hardware store carrying 2 buckets of paint, his shirt damp with sweat and speckled from earlier work. Since the trial, the old house no longer felt like a place of loss. It was a blank canvas, still standing, still his, and he was determined to make it a home again, not just for himself, but for Rex, Duke, and Brutus. The yard bore little resemblance to the place he'd first walked into after coming home. The warped wooden kennel was gone, dismantled piece by piece, its rotting boards stacked for disposal. In its place, Mason had leveled the ground and begun laying the foundation for something better. A wide fenced-in play area now spread across the back, enclosed by sturdy cedar panels tall enough to give the dogs privacy and security. At one end stood a sloped roof shelter, the frame already painted in a weather-resistant sealant, with room for shade on hot days and shelter from rain. The new addition that brought the most joy to Mason was the pool, a shallow, kidney-shaped pond lined with smooth stones. He'd dug it himself over 2 days, filling it with fresh water that reflected the pale blue of the sky. Near the far fence, he had assembled a training area, an agility tunnel, a few low jumps, and a sturdy platform for command exercises. Rex supervised each step as if inspecting the work. His sable coat was beginning to regain its sheen, the thick underlayer growing back after weeks of proper nutrition. He moved with calm assurance, often positioning himself where he could watch both Mason and the yard gate. Duke had filled out, the sleek muscles along his frame showing again as he trotted through the agility tunnel without prompting. The haunted look in his dark eyes had eased, replaced with alert curiosity. Brutus had become more playful, often padding up to Mason with a thick rope toy clamped in his jaws, tail wagging hard enough to sway his broad frame. One by one, neighbors began to appear. People who had once kept their distance now finding excuses to stop by. Mrs. Evelyn Carver, the silver-haired widow from across the street, arrived first, carrying a tin of homemade peanut butter biscuits shaped like bones. She handed them to Mason with a simple, "For the boys," before bending down to let Rex sniff her hand. Later came George Tanner, a retired dock worker with weathered skin and a permanent squint from years at sea. He brought a faded red ball under one arm and a bag of dog treats in the other. "Figured they might like something to chase," he said, tossing the ball to Brutus, who caught it mid-bounce with a triumphant grunt. Even young families joined in. The Martinez kids, Sophia and Lucas, shyly brought over a box of squeaky toys their own dog had outgrown. Sophia was 8, with long braids and a habit of whispering to animals as if telling them secrets. Lucas, 5, was more direct, crouching down to throw a ball for Duke over and over until the Doberman began to follow him around the yard. Mason accepted each gesture quietly, sometimes with a nod, sometimes with a brief smile. He noticed how the visitors lingered, watching the dogs run and play, their voices softening as if they understood without needing to be told that these animals had survived something they shouldn't have had to endure. As the days passed, the changes in Rex, Duke, and Brutus became more obvious. Their coats grew glossy, their eyes clear. They began to move with the easy confidence of dogs who no longer measured every sound for danger. Rex took to patrolling the yard in slow circuits, his head high, occasionally pausing to watch Mason from across the grass. Duke rediscovered the joy of sprinting, his lean body cutting smooth arcs around the play area before trotting back, tongue lolling. Brutus became the most vocal, rumbling happily whenever Mason approached with a leash, ready for a walk down to the shore. On the 6th evening after the renovations began, Mason finished attaching the last section of the roof over the shade shelter. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and crimson. The heat of the day had mellowed into a warm, salt-scented breeze. Rex lay near the fence, eyes half closed, while Brutus lounged by the pool, occasionally swiping a paw through the water. Duke sat at the center of the yard, ears pricked as if listening to something far away. Mason noticed the stillness that settled over him, the way his head tilted slightly toward the horizon. Then, without warning, Duke raised his head and let out a long, deep howl. The sound was rich and unhurried, carrying across the neighborhood like a voice reclaiming its place. It wasn't the sharp alarm bark of fear. It was a statement, a call that seemed to say, "We're here, we're home." Rex lifted his head, joining in with a steady, resonant note, and Brutus followed, his deeper tone filling in the harmony. Mason stood in the yard, listening, the fading sunlight casting long shadows at his feet. Somewhere beyond the fence, he could hear doors opening, neighbors pausing on porches to listen. When the howls faded into the breeze, Mason felt something shift, not just in the yard, but in the air of Clearwater Bay itself. The silence that had once kept people apart was gone. In its place was a sound that would be remembered, the declaration of 3 dogs who had survived, and the quiet promise of a man who had kept his word. The following week in Clearwater Bay brought softer days. The salty breeze off the ocean carried the smell of blooming jasmine from a neighbor's yard, and the streets seemed warmer, not in temperature, but in spirit. Mason was in the yard, mending a section of the fence after Brutus had leaned too heavily against it, when he heard the hesitant crunch of shoes on gravel. A young man stood just outside the open gate, shifting from one foot to the other. He was in his early 20s, tall but with a slight hunch, as though used to making himself smaller in other people's presence. His brown hair was sun-bleached at the tips, his skin pale but freckled, and a thin scar ran from the edge of his jaw down to his collarbone. He wore a faded gray hoodie with sleeves pushed to his elbows, and jeans that had seen better days. "You Mason Cole?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of nerves, but steady enough to show determination. Mason nodded. "That's me. Something I can help you with?" The young man stepped forward, his hands jammed into the hoodie pocket. "Name's Tyler Briggs. I heard about what happened. About Linda." He paused, glancing at Rex, who had risen to stand beside Mason, tail swishing but eyes alert. "She wasn't just cruel to animals. She used to be my foster guardian for about a year. Then one day, she just left me at the county shelter. I was 11. Mason studied him quietly, recognizing a kind of pain that never fully left a person's eyes. Tyler gave a short, humorless laugh. "Guess that's why I'm here. I know what it's like to be left behind. Figured maybe I could help take care of them. They've had enough of people walking away." It wasn't in Mason's nature to hand out trust easily, but there was no mistaking the honesty in the young man's tone. He opened the gate wider. "Come on in. They'll let you know if they like you." The moment Tyler stepped inside, Duke approached, head tilted, sniffing curiously. Brutus hung back, his deep brown eyes cautious, but Rex moved forward, giving the young man a slow, thorough inspection. Tyler didn't rush. He crouched low, offering the back of his hand, letting the dogs make the choice. After a moment, Rex gave a small huff and touched his nose to Tyler's knuckles. Duke wagged his tail. Brutus still kept his distance, but his ears were forward rather than pinned back. Over the next few days, Tyler proved himself. He came every morning early enough to help with feeding and stayed late enough to join the evening walks. Mason discovered that Tyler had a gentle patience with animals. He spoke little but moved with care, and the dogs seemed to read that in him. Even Brutus began watching him from across the yard, as though weighing whether to step closer. One evening, while sitting on the porch with mugs of coffee, Tyler hesitated before speaking. "You ever think about doing something for the kids around here? Teach them, I don't know, how to be around dogs, how to treat them right?" Mason tilted his head. "You mean like training sessions?" "Sort of, but more than commands. Make it about respect, responsibility. If they learn that early, maybe fewer animals end up like—" He trailed off, gesturing toward the dogs. It was an idea Mason couldn't ignore. 2 days later, he and Tyler posted a handwritten notice at the community center and the grocery store bulletin board. Free dog training and care workshops, Saturdays in Mason Cole's yard, all ages welcome. The first Saturday morning, the gate was lined with a small group of children and their parents. The Martinez kids were there, along with a shy boy named Caleb, who hid behind his mother's skirt, and a freckle-faced girl named Annie clutching a stuffed toy dog. Sarah Bennett even stopped by to watch, still wearing her scrubs from the clinic, her auburn hair pulled into a loose braid. They began with basics: how to approach a dog, how to read body language, the importance of gentle hands and calm voices. Rex demonstrated the sit and stay commands with military precision, earning laughter and applause from the kids. Duke showed off his agility by leaping through the tunnel, while Mason explained how exercise kept dogs healthy and happy. Brutus, however, stayed near the shade shelter, watching. His history had left him wary of strangers, especially children who moved too quickly. Mason didn't push him. He figured trust had to be earned at Brutus's pace. But Annie noticed him, her wide eyes following every shift of his posture. Midway through the session, when the other kids were practicing with Rex and Duke, Annie slowly knelt on the grass about 10 feet from Brutus. She didn't call him or extend her hand. She simply sat, letting the breeze ruffle her hair, her small frame still and quiet. Brutus's ears twitched. His gaze stayed on her for a long moment, and then, tentatively, he stepped forward. One paw, then another, until the space between them was gone. Annie didn't move until his nose brushed her fingers. Then she smiled and gave the gentlest stroke along his cheek. The yard fell silent. Mason, Tyler, Sarah, and the gathered parents all watched as Brutus leaned forward, his tongue flicking out to give a quick, shy lick to her small hand. It was over in an instant, but the meaning was clear. Something in Brutus had shifted. Tyler's voice was low but full of warmth. "Guess he's decided she's safe." Mason felt a tightness in his chest loosen. This was why they'd started the workshops. Not just to teach children, but to show dogs like Brutus that not every hand meant harm. As the group dispersed later that day, Annie waved from the gate, calling back to Brutus, "See you next week." For the first time, Brutus wagged his tail for someone outside his pack. 12 months had a way of reshaping everything. The once quiet yard behind Mason's home had transformed into a place of constant life. A wide cedar gate stood open most days, welcoming the shuffle of small feet, the slow steps of elders leaning on canes, and the laughter that seemed to bounce off the newly painted fence. Where there had once been a rusting chain-link enclosure, there now stood a grassy expanse, shaded by a few young maples, a small pond shimmering in the sun, and a low obstacle course for dogs and children alike. Rex, now with a silvery tint creeping into the sable of his muzzle, moved with the calm authority of an elder statesman. He oversaw playtime from a gentle distance, stepping in only when the younger dogs got too excited or when a game needed a steady paw to keep order. Duke had filled out, his once dull coat now a sleek black and tan that glinted in the light, his tail always in motion. Brutus still carried a hint of caution in his eyes, but the deep furrow of worry had eased, and he was the first to greet returning children with a soft, low woof. Clearwater Bay itself seemed to have embraced them. Miss Eleanor, a sprightly widow in her late 70s with snow-white hair and a fondness for floral dresses, had made it her mission to bring a basket of homemade treats for the dogs every Friday. "They're my grandpups," she liked to declare, slipping them biscuits as if they were precious contraband. The Johnson twins, wiry boys of 9 with boundless energy, came after school to help clean the water bowls and rake leaves, usually getting soaked or muddy in the process. Even Mr. Harris, the retired dock worker who once grumbled about barking, now lingered by the fence to toss a ball or two before heading home. One warm afternoon, Mason sat on the porch steps while Tyler stacked folding chairs for the Saturday workshop. Sarah Bennett arrived with her vet's bag slung over her shoulder, her auburn hair caught in the wind as she crossed the yard. She had grown even closer to Mason over the year, often staying after checkups to share a coffee and talk about the future. She gave Rex a slow scratch behind the ears before saying, "Got a letter for you, from the town council." Mason raised a brow and tore the envelope open. Inside was a formal invitation embossed with the Clearwater Bay emblem, a lighthouse rising above a wave. They wanted him to speak at the annual Harbor Lights Festival, the most anticipated event of the year. "They want me to tell the story?" Mason asked, almost to himself. Sarah smiled. "They want you to tell their story, because it's not just yours anymore." When the festival evening arrived, the waterfront park glowed with strings of golden lights, food stalls lining the boardwalk, and the mingled scents of grilled corn, salt water, and fresh pastries. Families drifted between booths while children ran toward the carousel, set up near the pier. Mason stood near the main stage, Tyler at his side, Rex, Duke, and Brutus sitting obediently by his boots. The dogs drew attention everywhere they went. People bent to pat their heads, some asking shyly if these were the famous 3 they had read about in the local paper. When his name was called, Mason stepped onto the wooden stage. The crowd quieted, the sound of the tide slapping against the shore faint in the background. He spoke plainly, telling the story of 3 dogs who had once been chained, starved, and forgotten, and of the people who had come together to change that. He didn't linger on his own role. Instead, he spoke of Sarah's care, Tyler's loyalty, the children's patience, the neighbor's kindness. "This isn't a story about rescue," Mason said, his voice steady. "It's a story about what happens when no one turns away, about how hearts, whether on 2 legs or 4, can heal when we choose to stand together." As he stepped down from the stage, applause rose, not the thunderous kind meant to celebrate a single person, but the warm, sustained kind that felt like a shared heartbeat. The sun had dipped below the horizon when the first fireworks streaked upward, bursting into gold over the bay. The dogs sat close, Rex in the middle, Duke on his left, Brutus on his right. Their eyes reflected the shimmer in the sky, ears twitching at each soft boom, but none of them flinched. Mason rested a hand on Rex's back and looked out over the water. They were no longer the shadows they had been a year ago, no longer the forgotten. Here, under the sky painted with light and sound, they were part of the rhythm of Clearwater Bay, the heart of a community that had learned, through them, the quiet power of compassion. Sometimes, the greatest miracles are not lightning from the sky, but quiet acts of love that God places in our path. 3 dogs once chained and forgotten found a home, a family, and a community because people chose compassion over indifference. In our daily lives, we may not all be called to rescue animals, but we are all called to notice those in need, to offer kindness, and to stand for what is right. Every small act of mercy is a reflection of God's grace working through us. If this story touched your heart, share it so others may feel the same hope. Leave a comment to tell us how you have seen God's hand in your own life. Subscribe to our channel to keep these stories of faith and compassion alive. And if you believe in the power of love and the blessings of the Lord, type Amen in the comments. May God bless and protect you and your loved ones every single day.